Pandemics are nothing new, and lots of things look the same this time as in other pandemics, but every pandemic is different from the last one. We're going to talk about models in this one. Models of epidemics and pandemics, because all epidemics have similarities, but the most important thing to understand about any pandemic is the tipping point. But wait, models aren't real. This isn't this, and this is certainly not this. This couldn't possibly be this, but it's useful. You don't get the view by standing on the map, but you can plan a route and navigate safely with it. So the map is a model of the territory. So we're going to try and explain something like this using something like this. It sounds unlikely, but, well, just bear with us. Let's have a look at the model. First, there's everyone who can catch the infection. They're the susceptible population. If they become infected, the number per day is called the infection rate. The rate depends on a few things. The higher the number of susceptible people there are, the higher the rate of infection, which kind of stands to reason because the more people are around, the more people can catch it. The higher the number of infected people, the higher the rate as well, because more people they catch it from. The more that people meet each other, also the higher the infection rate. And this is called the contact rate, which is the number of people a person comes into contact with per day. Then there's the infectivity, which is the probability that one of these contacts results in a person becoming infected. And it depends on a few things. In more simplistic terms, it's the virus itself and how effective it is into latching onto its new hosts. Some viruses are very effective at this, others aren't. And then there's how long the contact is for. So how long are you together? There's where it takes place, because if it's inside an enclosed space with turbulent recycled air and lots of surfaces, or outside with free airflow, then there's a big difference in what that contact means in terms of infectivity. And lastly, there's biosecurity. And biosecurity is about the distance between people, it's about washing hands, it's about using masks, it's about using screens, and so on. And lastly, we've got the number of the total population, because if this is a big number compared to the susceptible population, the infection rate is smaller because it's less likely for a susceptible person to meet an infected person. And then people recover. And they recover at the recovery rate, which is higher as the number of infected people increases, because there's more people to recover every day. And the duration of the infection, which is the length of time that someone is infectious for. So the recovery rate is lower if people are infected for longer. And this is the SIR model: susceptible, infected, recovered. And this is what it behaves like. It starts, like most pandemics, with almost everyone susceptible. And it's kind of a fundamental assumption for a pandemic. And almost no one is infected. Then the few infected people mix with the many susceptible people, and the pandemic starts to take off. This is the surge, and this is where the exponential increase happens. These exponential explosions are very hard to judge. So here's a story about one. It's about a clever courtier. He made a beautiful chessboard for the king, and he asked the king for 1 grain of rice for the first square on the board, and 2 grains of rice for the second square, and 4 grains of rice for the third square, and so on. The king agreed and ordered rice to be brought from the stores. The king thought it was a pretty good deal. So that's 8 grains of rice for the 4th square, 16 grains of rice for the 5th square. By the 21st square, there was over 1 million grains of rice. And on the 33rd square, there was 1 billion grains of rice. If they could have got to the end, there would have been enough rice to cover modern-day Iran to a depth of more than 5 feet. And that's what it is about these processes. They often grow so quickly that by the time you see them coming, it's already too late to control them. But eventually, they end. They run out of fuel. But when they start, there is no limit to the growth. And for a pandemic, the fuel is us. At the beginning, what's called a reinforcing loop is dominant. The more infected people, the higher the infection rate, creating more infected people that increases the infection rate, and so on, and so on, and so on. When the number of susceptible people reduces enough, a balancing loop takes over. It becomes increasingly less likely that an infected person can infect a susceptible person, and that's what the SIR model is all about. As the susceptible population decreases, the infection rate reduces, which is a balancing loop. As the infected group increases, the infection rate increases, which is a reinforcing loop. And as the infected group recovers, the infection rate decreases, which is a balancing loop. And this is clear in the behaviour of the model. So this is what it looks like. A reinforcing loop initially dominates, then a balancing loop takes over. The susceptible population eventually falls to zero, but there's an early peak of infection. And this was worked out by two folks who wanted to understand a particular pandemic, which was the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and that killed between 50 and 100 million people. Kermack and McKendrick set to work on understanding the dynamics of the pandemic. Their great discovery was the equation that predicted which loop, which is reinforcing or balancing, dominated under different conditions, and it's dead simple. This version is based on the work of John Sterman at MIT. The other guy there is Jay Forrester, because he more or less invented system dynamics, which is what this is about. The equation is made up of the things we've already seen: the contact rate, the infectivity, the duration of infection. Then there's the ratio of the susceptible population divided by the total population. R is called the reproduction number, CID is the contact number, and S over N is the proportion of the population that's susceptible. R is just a boundary. Its only purpose is to tell us which side of invisible line we're on. It's only going to tell us which loop is dominating. So if R is greater than 1, then the conditions will drive exponential growth. There's no question about that. There's no half measures. It's no ifs, no buts. It will. If R is less than 1, then the system will come back into balance. It's the reduction of infection. What's important for us, though, is that in this version of the model, the peak infection, here, occurs when less than 20% of the population are susceptible. And what this meant for the NHS was that the predicted peak would have far exceeded NHS capacity. Hence, lockdown. So the peak was reduced by keeping the susceptible population high. It's a bit like being chased by a hungry tiger, then managing to lock the tiger in your shed, and then realising you still need to cut the grass. The contact number was drastically reduced by lockdown because we didn't leave our houses. But S divided by N is still probably close enough to 1. It looks like that in where we are now, May 2020, more than 80% of the population may still be susceptible. So if we look at it another way, if we do a plot of contact number against the proportion of susceptible people, and we keep R at 1, that shows the boundary between control and exponential growth. So the corner we turned in April is probably this one. That's the tiger in the shed. And the corner we need to turn is probably nearer to this. Getting there without any new major infection outbreak means staying below the threshold of control. This, the safest route, is also the longest unless a vaccine appears quickly. It's a story of biosecurity, extensive testing, contact tracing and quarantines. The alternative is quicker, but riskier. Push R above 1, then trap the infection by lockdowns again and again until enough people are immune. And that sounds a bit tricky. And of course, we're always asking the question, could we stamp it out? Well, in the history of diseases we've eliminated so far, there have been a few things that have always been there. Like smallpox, polio and others, the disease only exists in humans. So, when it's eliminated in humans, it's gone forever. And immunity must last for a long time, years at least. And a vaccine must be available to reduce the susceptible population and dilute the contact effect. But the current evidence isn't too optimistic on these fronts. The history of vaccines, for instance, is pretty hit and miss. And it also looks a lot like the virus may be living in other animals. It looks like the immunity may not be as long as we need it to be as well. And it takes a coordinated, cooperative, global programme to eliminate reservoirs of infection that can come back, like tuberculosis did. So, if the susceptible population is high, the only way to control the reproduction number right now is through the contact number. And as the duration of infection is out of our control, which is D, that just leaves the contact rate and the infectivity. So another plot. If we plot infectivity while keeping R equal to 1 for different contact rates, and assume the infection lasts, say, 7 days, we get a different curve depending on the proportion of the population that is susceptible. The lowest curve is when 80% of the population is susceptible, perhaps where we are now, and the curves relax as we go through 60% susceptible, 40% susceptible, 20%, and then 10% of the population still susceptible. As lockdown is relaxed, we're probably in this zone, which means that the probability of becoming infected has to be between 1% and 5% for each contact to keep R below 1. So biosecurity must meet stringent numerical limits to guarantee control of the infection. Note that this doesn't stop people becoming infected at all. Far higher biosecurity would be necessary if the goal is to minimise infection, in the workplace for example. This will just keep the pandemic within control so that infections in the general population can be reduced. Again, what we're talking about here is testing, contact tracing, isolation, and very, very strict biosecurity. So, this is a story about models. And all models are at best only a thin slice of reality. They're highly specific tools that can be incredibly useful as long as we respect their limitations. And just understanding a bit about the dynamics of an epidemic, can give us the information we need to make better decisions for ourselves and society. So what I would say is, don't bank on optimism, trust the science. If you'd like to know more, or you have any suggestions for further subjects, drop me a line.